So that could only be explained by one thing: fate.
Dude, I hear she's a bitch.
500 Days of Summer. I've known this movie to carry a certain stigma around it, a lot like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, where you can usually pretty safely assume that guys who absolutely love it are men that women should stay very, very far away from. But dissimilar from Scott Pilgrim and how I think it missed the punch on following through with the subtext critiquing this kind of protagonist, I regularly find 500 Days to be far more than it's accused of being, and I would go so far as to maybe suggest that it can be somewhat unfairly maligned because the kind of person that it's about is so real. It almost did its job too well. It's one of those rare movies, I think, which actually speaks about this very common kind of situation or person with a huge degree of reality. And maybe it's because this movie did it so well that nobody else had to try. The films that I find 500 Days useful to compare it to are the classic genre hits that people like its protagonist Tom would probably adore, like Taxi Driver, Joker, those movies about loneless being lonely and stuff. But whereas those are artsy movies in themselves, 500 depicts the actual fantasy this sort of person lives in, while the protagonist isn't a spiraling, violent malevolent, just a realistically discontented young man. If you aren't aware of the movie, the story is about Tom, a young guy who's looking back on a relationship that he shared with Summer, a woman who he believed was his soulmate, but with whom things didn't work out. It's a non-linear narrative directed by Mark Webb, who would go on to direct both Amazing Spider-Man films, if you've seen those, and it's a deeply energetic, sharply funny, very human film that is far more cutting about its subject matter than it has any right to be. It investigates the start of a relationship, the way that these two people do or don't communicate with each other, and both its structure and its zany choices allow it to portray really difficult ideas and emotions very distinctly without feeling saccharine or sappy. Subtle things like that momentary inspiration that you might feel after meeting someone who encourages you before realizing that you're being stupid. It's like you feel all of that. The build and then the... ugh. It captures that moment and moments like it really, really well, often by exaggerating it or playing it on screen the way that it feels and not the way that it looks in real life. Or maybe the entirety of the meticulously composed reality expectation sequence, which speaks to a very real, honestly very ugly way of feeling that I've seen few other films take a real stab at. This is just, it's so innate, right? Everyone has felt like this at some point. Such a universal feeling that's actually captured very, very honestly on screen in this sequence. The best part about 500 Days to me has become the degree to which it sticks to that honesty, no matter how ugly it might be, whilst taking such a blatantly film-centric approach. It has narration, it uses cutaways, changing aspect ratios, frequent uses of montage and unreal editing techniques, helps contextualize the relationship that, for its protagonist, is built on a response to media as being overtly media. It allows the film to show Tom in extremely unflattering ways without ever being an uncomfortable film to watch for too long, and since it's something of a critique of how pop culture can raise young men to approach romance and relationships, it being so obviously a movie is an extremely clever meta approach. People like this do kinda see real people like characters and want their love to go like it does in stories. This is how Tom would make a movie about himself, but occupies that framework with a love interest who blatantly belongs outside of it, doesn't play by those filmic rules, or at the very least requires more than a cursory storytelling lens to fully understand as a human with depth. It might be easiest to explain the film by saying it's a bit of a deconstruction of the manic pixie dream girl trope often seen in media, like Scott Pilgrim or Garden State or even Wall-E and Firewatch. Yeah, I said it. But the more I grow, or the more this film stays the same, the more I come to feel like it's less of an examination of the woman here, more about guys in real life existing basically in response to media instead of being real people. I don't expect everyone to have the same viewpoint of it, I just unfortunately see a lot of my own past selves in this, and to me it feels crushingly realistic, using that filmic trope lens to take a genuine stab at leveling with young men. Basically saying, hey, we see you, we know how this feels, but if you are doing anything this guy is doing, you've gotta stop. It's in this really weird position. If you relate to Tom, you should probably be terrified about that. The less you see of yourself and how you navigate relationships, the less aspirational you see this guy as being, the better off you are. Again, like Scott Pilgrim, only here the movie feels much more aware of that. So anyone who relates to this movie might appreciate it more and be spoken to it more fully, but anyone who can look at this really detached has that obvious lack of investment that makes spitting at this kind of guy a lot easier. So I really understand where that stigma would come from. And yeah, in many circumstances, treating Summer the way that Tom does deserve to be met with a foot put down, but 500 Days isn't entirely unkind and chooses to meet what can still be a complicated and hurtful kind of self-reflection for young men with the right amount of kindness, acknowledging that while there is an obvious need to grow, your own feelings are still valid to you, and feeling hurt in itself isn't something to be ashamed of, which is why the film's delightful color palette, generally cheery tone, sublime score and music choices, and extremely detailed production is so winning to me. That underbelly is so scary because it's presented in such a genuine way. The chemistry between Zooey Deschanel and Joseph Gordon-Levitt is legendary. Their moments of fun together come across really well, as do their disagreements and fights, with the film sticking to keeping Summer somehow really shrouded in mystery whilst the whole film revolves around the idea of her. Summer is kept at a distance by the film's choices, very rarely showing her perspective on events, almost never showing her without Tom, and her biggest moments of character growth or decision making are often shot from Tom's perspective or happen entirely off screen. The total removal of her point of view is such a careful and consistently maintained choice that solidifies to me the point the movie is actually trying to make. My relationship with this film, originally released in 2009, has gone through several phases, which is one of the reasons I find it such a compelling movie to return to every few years. Initially, as a teenager when I first watched it, I thought Summer turned out to be a total bitch. A year or two later, it was Tom who turned out to be a controlling freak. Ew. A bit later, I observed the seesaw of them both letting each other down at various times. I started to see hurtful amounts of myself in the character and realized I hadn't learned a fucking thing. And on this most recent rewatch, have finally started to feel like I've grown beyond the kind of person that this is and can take a more removed perspective to this movie. I've no doubt in another few years I'll watch it again and feel different things about the characters, the people, all over again. It's a running thread in my favorite films where I love to see details I've never noticed before, but 500 Days might be the only film that I walk away from emotionally in a totally new way every single time. It's only now that I look at the scene after he and Summer have slept together for the first time, the most joyous scene in the film, and feel pity. I mean, it's the happiest we see him, but Summer isn't there, and he just doesn't understand that he's made this all about him. Dude just needs help. I see him in the pivotal scene where Summer tries to open up to him a bit, wearing the same Joy Division shirt that he was wearing as a child, saying in so few words how he hasn't grown at all beyond his childish presumptions of what relationships are supposed to be, which he learned from watching movies in the first place. It's easy to find the moments of stiff communication between them, Tom regularly ignoring saying what he actually feels to try and protect this image of himself that he wants, being completely emotionally stunted or inarticulate, wanting to go along with this girl that he likes but clearly doesn't want what he wants. The time where his approach to women or life exposes his own insecurities and their almost wholly misogynistic roots, and now I start to see the warning signs about him as early as here.
Holy shit.
It's like a showcase and critique of the modern casual misogynist from inside, and for any young white man growing up in the Western world, I would consider this film essential viewing at some point in your teenage life.
Maybe different hair. Probably, she'd probably be a little more into sports, but truthfully, Robin's better than the girl of my dreams. She's real.
Princeton. Most likely you'll know our son, Dickie Greenleaf.
I couldn't help noticing your jacket.
Yes.
Class of 56.
How is Dickie?
Let's switch gears to the opposite end of the spectrum and talk about the next movie. Instead of being a film concerned with the very straight man issue, The Talented Mr. Ripley is a film about repression, just generally, emotional, economical, sexual, you name a kind of personal repression, and The Talented Mr. Ripley, starring a near-perfect ensemble cast of Matt Damon, Jude Law, Gwyneth Paltrow, Kate Blanchett, Philip Seymour Hoffman, and Jack Davenport, among others, probably focuses on it with devastating power. There has never been that much beautiful in a movie before or since, and boy howdy, has there also never been that much fear in my soul. It's a seductive, beautiful, pained, understated thriller opus that changed my life when I first saw it, but it's also a few other things at least. The first is a movie you absolutely do not want spoiled. It's a very famous story, but I think knowing as little as possible really makes this movie a different kind of gripping. Every time I watch it, I am as thrilled as ever, but the viscerality of that first viewing when I had no idea what was in store for me was white-knuckled and raw, and I would strongly encourage you to go and do the same if you're interested. The film has a slightly unwieldy premise at first, but it's based on a classic novel of the same name from the 50s, and part of the appeal of the film to me is in the understatedness of its story. Thomas Ripley is a pianist and a gifted performer who doesn't really have a whole lot of money, but he's confused for an ex-student of a more affluent college than the one he actually attended by a man of wealth. The man, Herbert Greenleaf, has a son who attended this college named Dickie Greenleaf, who has absconded to Italy. Dickie's father wants Dickie to come home, so he pays Tom, who he believes to know Dickie but who doesn't, to go and get him. Tom travels there, finds Dickie, and falls in love with the Italian lifestyle, and seeks to extend his stay there and try and seize this strange opportunity which has come his way to live the life that he's always wanted to live beyond his means. Again, a slightly unwieldy premise, but basically an old rich man goes up to Will Hunting with glasses and a comb over and says, "Hey, check it out. How about I pay you to go to Italy, like the most beautiful country in the world? How about I pay you to go there and you go get my son? You know my son, right?" And then, like any normal person would, Tom is like, "Yes, I know who that is." And on paper, it would seem for the first stretch of the film that it would be a fairly banal affair. Not exactly sure where things are going, but where the story goes is anything but. But like I said, I am going to talk about that. That's all you're getting. If you're a fan of films like The Favourite or Parasite, The Talented Mr. Ripley novel is one of the classic examples of a similar setup. A poor or a new money outsider enjoying the opportunities of an affluent life that they enter into through deception, often using gifts that their poverty has forced them to learn. They slip into more wealthy communities but attempt to not be found out as the imposter that they feel they are. Ripley is probably the least comedic take on those three, and it's also the first film I saw which told a story from that setup. Both of those reasons make it a film that I'm just personally more partial to. I read the Ripley novel afterwards, but as with a lot of good film adaptations, it turned out to not really be necessary for me to do that for more than curiosity. The film makes a number of substantial changes, or clarifications, shall we say, to characters, and adds plot lines which held a lot of the appeal for me and added to the stakes of the film significantly. But also, because a lot of the original story is about the performance of an outsider in high society, much of the book spends its time describing mannerisms and the way that people behave. And with such excellent casting and strong performances in this film, it's hard to overlook how naturally that story and that particular element suits the screen as its arena. There's only one moment from the book which I kind of miss. It works brilliantly in the book, but might have been a bit of a tough sell for suspension of disbelief. It's probably for the best that the movie drew a line before that, because I simply have not seen a movie with a more deft handling of tension than this one. The way that the stakes are so clear but the consequences are left to the terrified imagination makes the danger feel endless and existential. The way the character motivations are so innately understood allows for the visual storytelling to be working just as hard as the dialogue, like watching layers of different stories unfold all in the same moments. Decisions are made with just the right amount of push and pull. The energy of this film is so tightly wound, and its understanding and in part bombardment of so many kinds of tension, often simultaneously from multiple plot lines at once, is masterful. It somehow turns tropes that often go down well in comedy into something like a high wire balancing act above a 300-foot drop and just teeters there. It's also, therefore, the film of any of my favorites that I've sat down to watch the fewest number of times, because it scares the shit out of me. I don't have the stomach for this one every day. Not because it's super violent, not because it's really long or anything, but because the character of Thomas Ripley and Matt Damon's performance thereof is actually unbearable on certain days. It's just too much to handle emotionally. He's unfortunately a character and a performance that I feel extremely seen by. However, I think that is a somewhat common experience of this very famous character. I believe he's been engineered that way. If you're a big fan of audience insert protagonists like Kay in Blade Runner 2049, or like people you look at the screen and you go, oh, it's literally me! Thomas Ripley is the most challenging version of that concept. He loves art but is anxious and shy and lonely. He wants people to like him but is unassuming and meek. He doesn't super know how to socialize despite being gifted and having a lot of talent. Would probably rather hang out with the dog at a party rather than get drunk and dance or something, you know? Like, typical indie Tumblr folks. Somebody whose flaws and anxieties are very apparent and painful and observable but so human that how strongly you root for him is probably tied to how much of yourself you see in him. He's an outsider who's pretending to belong in a kind of life that he wants but wasn't born into, is hiding or different aspects of himself, which appeals directly to the underdog story that we all love so much, but it takes what feels like the most realistic and unflattering look at that setup that it could, and because of all of this self-identification stuff weaved into his character, he becomes extremely deeply confronting. The things that initially attract me to Ripley, the things that I identify with, that draw other characters to him, end up over time warping to become the same aspects which cause the most discomfort. The movie showed me this character who I was identifying very strongly with in stages of feelings that I'd experienced sometimes years prior, but had never really considered all that deeply and had not really seen on a screen before, and told a story about them in a way that made me feel comforted and understood and less alone in the world, as well as totally exposed and utterly pathetic all at once. Again, it scares the shit out of me, and I can't do it every day. Hell, I can't do it most days. Of a particular strength are the film's use of extreme close-ups and deep point of view, somehow conveying the subtle difference between when Tom is observing an entire situation keenly and noticing every detail, and when he's distracted by one of those details, when he allows himself to become emotional or gets his guard a little too low. The power of dialogue is significant as well, asking you to engage with each situation intellectually before your emotion in order to pass what's real from what you know is manufactured in each scene, but keep your own eye on the distance that you're slowly being led from the truth. Obviously, the time period and the setting of the film, 1950s Italy, Rome, is of supreme enough beauty to make the film interesting enough to look at just by default, but the way the photography cuts to aerial angles on occasion, the location scouting within those environments, and the specificity of the things it plays in close-up are worth paying attention to. And it makes this, probably of any of the movies I'm talking about today, the most cinematographically considered, keenly mimicking the protagonist's own sense of composure at any given time. But while you're sitting in the audience, keeping track of all that information means that your emotional reaction to the story is lagging behind you, slowly creating this pile-up which threatens to reach a breaking point, instilling just utter panic. To look at the way that Ripley behaves and all at once want him to succeed, and have felt what he's felt so deeply myself, but feel so disgusted and off-put by him the longer you're around him, is such an unspeakably strange balance captured so well, because he's all at once mirror and monster, to the point they blur together and I lose track of which is which. Oh look, that's a common photographic motif here as well. Fuck me sideways. There's a lot of love for many performances in this adaptation. No shit, you got some of the best actors in the world in this movie. Jude Law as Dickie Greenleaf specifically is quite beloved, but for my money, this is the performance of Matt Damon's career, and one of my favorite performances by a leading actor in any film. It's both a haunting and stupefying display of an actor's power and how well conveyed the character is stylistically and photographically for him to be so focused on, yet feels so hollow and creeping. He's like a personification of a black hole. What I will say on the weekend of this film is some of the dialogue. With actors this excellent, it usually doesn't feel as wooden as it maybe could have, but in some moments the writing can feel slightly ordinary, and it's an aspect of this film which makes it, to me, another one that I like that's also extremely subjective. There are several other very famous adaptations of Ripley novels that you'll possibly enjoy more, with alternate takes on the character or universe, and if you've seen and enjoyed films like Parasite, a fantastic movie, maybe this film won't scratch the same itch for you as it does for me. But I can say, at least personally, few films have rocked me as hard as this one did and still does, and no film I've seen, even Outward Horrors, has scared me a tenth as deeply. I slowly curl into a ball over the course of the runtime until my heart is pounding out of my chest, my eyes are puffy, and my hands are bleach white, slowly rocking back and forth, fetal position, gaze lingering on those final shots like I'm waiting to be released.
I like him. Marge, you like everybody. Oh, I like him. Marge, you like everybody.
Bloody legal action? No, no, no. Forget it. I don't want anything more to do with the bastard.
Oswald?
Yes.
Why not?
Because I'm scared of him. Just really bloody scared of him.
It might not seem like it today, but most films that I enjoy, like seriously enjoy, are downers in some way or another. And that's certainly true of this film as well. It's just, I prefer the gloomier, solemn stuff, but never let it be said that I'm heartless. I don't like dark stories just for the sake of it. I like it so that I can feel warmer at the end of it. There's something about endearment and hope that shines brighter through films or stories that first run a gauntlet of hell. And no film I've seen strikes that stark balance between darkness and light, or innocence and reality, better than Broken by Rufus Norris. There's something about how tragedy is offset by humanity that enhances the effect of both in this deeply dark but very innocent and quiet story starring Eloise Lawrence, Tim Roth, Rory Kinnear, and Cillian Murphy, wearing glasses. On the surface, it tells the beginning of a coming-of-age story about Skunk Cunningham, a young girl starting high school in modern England. Her father is a caring but preoccupied lawyer. Her brother is just starting to experiment with sex and cigarettes. The family Oswald next door are the worst neighbours you can imagine. There's a small family across the road, the Buckleys. Rick Buckley is their only son, a young man. But the film begins with Skunk witnessing Rick Buckley being savagely beaten, seemingly at random, by Mr. Oswald in the middle of the day. What follows is a story which is at many moments a modern British echo of the American classic To Kill a Mockingbird. And yet, despite its highly adult themes and its shift toward a mental health focus, its intensely emotional back half and its keen examination of the coin flip of fear and courage in the lives and minds of young children, it's made with what feels like such a genuine joy and affection that leaps through the screen at every moment. It feels like everyone who made this movie had an incredible time doing it, and for every choice that it still, every single time, makes to rip tears from my face, unbidden, it'll offset that horror with something inexplicably sweet. There's a refreshing nature to the way this movie comes across like it wasn't totally planned out, and it's probably thanks to its director, Rufus Norris, being a man of theatre. Currently, he's the artistic director and the joint chief executive of London's Royal National Theatre, and his eye for both the perfect performers for these roles, as well as how to capture their natural energy and chemistry with a highly naturalistic camera style, inverts the expected cinematographically, often going handheld when people are at their most easy and excited, plays like memories with an unstressed, imperfect visual voice which would typically be used for moments of action and uncertainty, allows for the performers to act scenes fully and with an enormous amount of dynamic. Lets the audience focus in on just their faces and the way that they look at each other. Contrasting, the shots are often rock solid when things are at their most exposed, inducing a deep sense of disquieting tension by cutting between these two, often without warning. Camera movement is often synonymous or sort of proportional to how extreme the emotion the performer is providing in any given scene is, and the removal of any camera movement signifies and instills a huge level of uncertainty. Abstractions of audio, misplacements of time. It plays the way you want to see it. It's such an organic film. Watching this movie, to me, feels like experiencing love, and it always did. Broken wasn't only one of the first independent films I probably ever saw. It wasn't just the first film I'd ever seen at an independent cinema. It was the movie to show me what I really love about visual media, and it remains a go-to for me for inspiration. No film has taught me more about what I like in aesthetic, storytelling, and editing styles than this one. It's given me so very, very much over the years, and it continues to blow my mind. Any and all of the artistic projects I've really tried at owe probably a lot of their essence to the way this movie is edited, its use of music, its choices and its pace and its scene transitions. By this point, I just think I've internalized this way of making a visual piece. Who's to say whether I make my choices because I like this movie and want to imitate it, or I was born with a disposition for this particular idiom? But even when I approached it as a 15-year-old, I remember feeling extremely emotionally matched to the choices it was making, or just somehow more vulnerable to them. If someone has seen some of my more ambitious or artsy visual works here on my channel and then watches this movie, I'm sure you'd understand where I'm coming from. The way the movie is made is just, it just helps me breathe. It's just like when I hear Daniel Rosson's music, it's just the way that it should be. I think of this movie as my personal gold standard for editing and everything that falls under that. The same shot that I think of whenever I'm trying to do something interesting or channel some kind of energy, like real energy, into something that I'm working on. I think of the shot in the movie that when I first saw it, I knew I was falling in love with the movie, was when they cut back to the yellow bucket by the car 5 minutes later.
Where the hell did I put my glasses?
Red sofa.
All right.
There's a lot to be said for how films about children can often dumb down their language or make things family-friendly in themselves to the point where it doesn't really feel like they're real kids. Whereas something like Stranger Things has the kids swearing, and it makes it feel like a more real, more actually representative piece of the lived experience of young people. Broken has that energy within a British space, so obviously a hell of a lot more swearing, and it isn't just right on the edge of adulthood, it's kind of about how kids can be cheated out of their childhoods unfairly by a world where confused, careless adults themselves no longer understand what that joy or stage of life really means. It's an extreme example of how adult lives can encroach upon what should be a happy time for kids to learn about living without pressures, about the freedom that they need to live and have fun and make mistakes and make their own choices, but the protection that they also require from real harm. How the innocence of childhood isn't something that, unfortunately, tragically, everybody gets to grow out of. Sometimes it's taken away from you, or sometimes it's forced upon you, or sometimes you miss out on it entirely. Sometimes the world makes you think that joy is something to hide, to get beaten out of you. Unbroken does such a marvelous job at conveying both sides, the imagination and the wonder, with the horror and the sadness, and a cast full of flawed characters who each make their own mistakes, including the central character, Skunk, played with a startling power by Eloise Lawrence. Eloise is now, as an adult, an incredible singer-songwriter, and peppered throughout Broken are songs actually sung by her as a 12-year-old, filling up the empty spaces in the open corners of the film, not just on the screen with her acting, but also in the bones of the non-diegetic elements with the genuine smile and infectious energy of a character whose glow is indescribable. In comparison to the other films of my favorites, Broken's substance is relatively straightforward, but there's something something inimitable about it to me. It has a quality that I haven't felt echoed since, not even in films plainly inspired by it, like The Daughter, directed by an Australian theatre director several years later. Norris has only directed one film since, I believe, an adaptation of the extremely strange musical London Road, which I unfortunately didn't much care for, and I don't know if I'll ever find a film quite like Broken again. It balances the abstractions afforded by visual media and movie making with a natural atmosphere with its talented cast well enough to receive a supreme amount of power from both, knowing when to use an editing trick on the screen to do its talking and conveyance, but also knows when to let the picture and the actor and the writer breathe and do the talking on its own, capturing an exchange from the most evocative but subtlest angle possible. On its darkness, this film has a complicated, multi-layered employment of violence, class, and mental health, thematic elements which are certainly worth grappling with, of course, when the time arises, and Broken's perhaps boldest trait is how it relies mostly on the feeling that the movie imparts as a work for its message, probably more so than anything in its writing. The film is a highly interpretable one. There's one sequence I still don't quite know what it's supposed to be about, but I know I turn into a puddle every time. In the words of my sibling Ray, you walk away from this movie feeling more than thinking. And there's a time and a place for art like that, and I think Broken really nails that idea. I really, really wish this was my favorite movie. I really do. If I was to ever start making short films or features with live action footage instead of game stuff all the time, Broken is probably the movie that my work would try to look the most like, and I wish that I could say that it was the best film I've seen.
You can never forget how important this is.
I know.
I know it's routine, but I know it's hard.
Say it's okay, Dad.
What?
I said I was sorry. Now you have to say it's okay.
It's okay.
Fine, use a plant.
You can't use plants for every trick.
There'll be no seats left for the punters.
All right, no bullet cash, whatever, but the point is that a real magician tries to invent something new that other magicians are going to scratch their heads over, you know?
Go home. Forget this thing. I can recognize an obsession. No good will come of it.
If you understand an obsession, then you know you won't change my mind.
We were two young men at the start of a great career. Two young men devoted to an illusion. Two young men who never intended to hurt anyone.
I can't live like this.
Oh, well, you think I can live like this? You think I bloody enjoy living like this?
All the time, he doesn't know when I'm looking.
All the time, Olivia. That's who he is. That's what it takes. He lives, he's acts. Don't you see?
Total devotion to his art. Utter self-sacrifice.
The audience knows the truth. The world is simple.
I'm sorry.
You don't know? You don't know?
It's called Some Movies I Like. This video, that is, it's really about my 4 favorites. 4 films I'll happily talk about at nearly any time of any day. I have kind of wanted to talk about these films in a video for a long time, but I never really had a reason. Didn't know how to how The Prestige does this or that. I just decided I don't need one. I just like the movies. I know who I do this for. I know who I do almost anything for. I like these movies because they're good movies, sure, but they're my favorites because of how I've felt connected to them over a period of years. I see a lot of myself in them. I see a lot of myself in 500 Days, not great parts, people I've left behind. Hopefully. Similar in Ripley, although much darker. In Broken, I see a love that I aspire to. But for The Prestige, there are a few movie-related activities that I've taken more joy in. I've been, frankly, honored to sit with probably close to 20 different people who are watching it for the first time, where I can enjoy one of life's most singular treasures. A film about artistry, about art's relationship to an audience and also its meaning to other practitioners, which is itself an exhibition of its own point and a love-laden sonnet to the beauty of art's place in the world and an aggrieved elegy for the people who lose themselves in its production and the weeds of its commerce. Man's reach exceeds his imagination indeed, for I would never have imagined such a story could be so potently told. Even so, Christopher Nolan, who directed this movie, has always made his best projects when his collaborators have strong voices in the finished product. As his career has continued and his budgets become bloated, it seems the amount of people around him who are allowed to say no to his ideas has dwindled and dwindled to the point where he's simply going on a tour of making a hollow, gargantuan version of whatever genre next makes sense for an all-time director to hit. I'll do a heist movie, I'll do a space movie, I'll do a war movie and a spy movie, now a black and white period piece. They might be, enjoyable, but The Prestige is his strongest film, and it's because of the writing penned by his brother, and it's based on an original novel by somebody else. The casting, including several performers such as Hugh Jackman and Rebecca Hall, whom he hasn't collaborated with since, giving this film a sense of uniqueness in his lineup. David Julian's sublime, eerie, mysterious, creeping score, as opposed to the blaring, domineering monstrosities which smother all of his other movies. The production design having flavor to it, the actual story being allowed to be what you're watching. And the only place where The Prestige is consistently let down, or the only obstacle perhaps that it comes up against, is the actual filmmaking. At this point early in his career, Nolan still adopted a pretty fast and street-level shooting style, where the only shots he feels confident with are character close-ups, sometimes only playing out scenes using them. His establishing shots are characteristic of this time in his work, very meek. The beautiful sets and the world of the film can feel contained and wasted. The editing at important times is ill-advised, failing to sell the effect, I suspect, in the same way that Nolan might today, or making just curious choices which I don't know if they pay off. It's difficult not to think about how this movie would have looked differently in the hands of Fincher or Boyle at the time, or of a Nolan today. As it is, this version of The Prestige is the one that we have, and an argument is made in favor of this understated approach, particularly coming from the director whom it does. It's kind of ironic in some ways. Understatement is a creative approach, particularly when telling cerebral stories that I greatly admire, likely in part due to how this film requires such close attention to decipher and how long I've loved this movie. Whether its method and what it does or doesn't place emphasis on with its photography is intentional misdirection or not, the film itself becomes a layered and densely woven tapestry of character and motive played understated. And what it gains on rewatches is educational. How to make a story not just emotionally involving, but intellectually rewarding every single time you return. How to build a film with which a relationship forms. How to make the story worth going through the entirety of every time. That's what storytelling is about to me. And it's still carried by those performances, by that production design, by the writing and the atmosphere and the story. And I quite seriously, forget creativity, probably wouldn't be the same person without this film championing the message that it does. Warts and all, it's probably an old habit from my early YouTuber days, but I just love having favorites. I like pointing at a thing, whether it's a game, a movie, a person, and going, you. I pick you. It's romantic, and I pick The Prestige. I pick this movie with all my issues and everything of it because of the writing, the screenplay. I come back to it when I've forgotten why I make things. Not only because it's a wonderful and awe-inspiring story and film, told and acted really well, which is itself quite inspiring, but also because it lays a clear foundation and builds characters as examples to the various approaches one can have to being an artist. It speaks to why someone would do this at all. I try to focus on a new aspect of the movie every time I do watch it, whether it's a different character like a Chekhov play, or a different aspect of the production, or the photography, or the writing and the hints of dialogue. The polish on the story, the worth in it is staggering to me. How to make every line mean different things on 8 different viewings, make more and less sense each and every time, while still feeling natural and human and staying away from being robotic and processed. I've probably gotten ahead of myself. The Prestige is a story concerned with a magician's rivalry between between Robert Angier, the wealthy performer, and Alfred Borden, the brash practitioner. They begin the story each with aspirations to perform magic on stage, but after Angier's wife becomes the tragic casualty of a trick gone wrong, a bitter and deadly rivalry forms, which will span across and infect the entirety of their careers. A non-linear story unfolding in the nature itself of a magic trick, The Prestige delves into the nature of an artist's view on art and people who make better art than you do. Set in the Victorian era on the advent of electricity, a time of scientific fascination, and it's centering on the somewhat lost and dangerous art of performative stage magic during that time, appeals to the peak of the age. Projected against the understated backdrop of Edison v Tesla, the rivalry between Angier and Borden not only offers comment on the nature of art, but the nature of different classes' approaches to art. How Angier sees more value in the show and the audience, and in how much money he spends in pursuit of becoming the genuine article which Borden seems to really truly be. A drive that he's gained to be the best has given great benefit to his magic, but come at the cost of his presentation, his ability to actually reach and appeal to people. How Edison sought to steal and quell Tesla's real benevolent science during that time is an important mirror in the story here, and the casting of David Bowie as Nikola Tesla only grows to become a more powerful and exceptional choice the further into legend that Bowie himself ascends. Angier approaching the performance of magic as a trick to be solved in itself, a formula to know and reproduce, taking Borden's innovations and self-made approaches to his work and consuming them, reproducing them on a grander scale which misses the original point entirely. His own opus becomes a merely enlarged version of the same bird trick the industry considered a safe and complacent one in the first place. The Prestige offers a period look at the difference between a homegrown independent artist and the rich stealing or appropriating, perverting their work, slowly killing them and robbing them of their livelihoods, whilst also critiquing the independence limitations, their self-destructive views on sacrifice, their deeply toxic self-imposed work culture, and their, at times, distrustful, aggressive sense of entitlement. Hugh Jackman as Angier is an obvious and very natural choice. I've been fortunate enough to see the man live in an arena, and he is every bit as engaging in person as he is on a screen. Probably even more so. Every eye of like 25,000 people was glued to him. I don't know how one person commands that kind of attention. He takes to this showman role with a grace that he makes look easy, like he's not trying too hard, carrying his natural likability in with him. But the unexpected benefit, as anyone who's seen his work in Prisoners would know, is Jackman's gift for performing obstinance, paranoia, and self-deception. This is a deeply layered, engaging performance. Rebecca Hall is the unsung hero of this film, offering a real, needed, dramatic sense of escalation to the events of the film with a beautiful, subtle, grounded presence, enhancing the other performances around her with razor-sharp focus. Michael Caine plays a uniquely low-status character for him, leaning into the aggressive sides of his character with great power, scrappily rounding out the story dependably, again, lifting every performer around him. Christian Bale! Can't say enough good things about him in this movie. Holy shit. I could talk about this film endlessly, deconstruct it with full spoilers and everything. I could do a fucking commentary on it, man, but just as a recommendation as it is, Angier's final soliloquy is my favorite moment in cinema. The world is simple, miserable, solid all the way through. That bit, I think it speaks to something very deeply in me and in the heart, I suspect, of anyone who ever made something. I have tried to live by a lot of what this movie talks about. I have done the most I can to enjoy it in a better way. I continue to do so, but I've probably not sat by you as you watched or listened to something that I made. I can only imagine. And that's no way to live. It's not really sustainable. I should play more live music. I just should. But I watch this film and I know that if it can make me feel the way that it does, then there is a point to all of this, to making things. There's a reason. Maybe I won't ever get to see it myself, but there's a point.